Hello, my name is Sean Castriani. I'm going to be presenting an introduction to Xamarin.Forms. In order to introduce you to Xamarin.Forms, I'm going to create a small app called eBay Browser. It will support both Android and iOS. It will allow the navigation of the eBay category hierarchy. It will display popular items within each eBay category, and it's going to access the eBay data through eBay's own web services. So let's get started. Here is Xamarin Studio running on my MacBook Pro. I have already created a stock Xamarin.Forms application from the templates that are provided with Xamarin Studio. This is my PCL project. I've got an Android project and an iOS project. Let's go ahead and run this just to see what the Xamarin Studio template provides out of the box. So here's my iPhone 4S simulator, and when I run it, you can see I'm going to get a simple Welcome to Xamarin.Forms application. Let's go ahead and start adding our eBay data to this. So I'm going to stop this, and let's look at the actual app. So here is where the Welcome to Xamarin.Forms is coming from. So I'm going to get rid of this, and instead I'm going to create a page for displaying eBay categories. So let's call it a category page. So I already have a folder called pages, so I'm going to add my category page here. And this will extend a Xamarin.Forms content page, which is just a generic page that will allow me to put any kind of content I want inside. So of course I have to add my usings, and I should be to then add a title. So let's add in a title of, let's call it categories for now. And now I want to create a list where the eBay categories are going to go. So I'm going to create a private variable. Let's call it list view, and we will construct that here. And we will set the content of this page to that list view. So the entire page will just be one list view. Now I want to populate this list view with data. So let's go back to our slides and look at the actual example URLs that we have to do this. So here I've pre-calculated two URLs for the eBay web services. One is for getting categories, one is for finding popular items. If you can see on this URL that it is set to respond with JSON data, and I have the ability to add in a category ID at the end. If you use -1, then it's going to show you the top level categories. So if I click this, it'll actually show, execute that web service and give me the results. Now, but this is just raw JSON. I would like to take this raw JSON and turn it into, let's say, a list of categories, an actual C# object that I can use in my code. So if I copy this URL, there's a very cool website called JSON to C#, and it will take either raw JSON or a URL that's going to return JSON. So if I paste this in here and click generate, I will get these POCOs, or plain old C# objects. I can then take these POCOs and add it to my PCL project so that I can use it when I take my JSON and deserialize it or convert it back into these C# objects. I have already done this in my PCL project for both this URL as well as the find popular items URL. So let's show those models. So here's the models that JSON to C# provided for the find popular items web service call. You can see I've got an actual class for an actual eBay item that's for sale, and I have the same C# objects you just saw for the get category info web service call. So I've already added these to a models directory for my PCL. Now let's actually create a web service call. So to do that, I'm going to use the standard interface implementation approach, where I create an interface, which I've already done ahead of time, called iEBay service, and it has essentially two methods, one for each of those URLs. One to get categories, where I can optionally give it a parent category, and another to find popular items, where again I can give it a category that I want to find items within. But notice that it returns a task. This is important so that because this is a web service, which could take a while to execute since it's going over the internet, you want to be able to await that web service call so that your UI does not lock up while it's being run. So by making it be a task, you can await that. It uses C#'s async and await API. So now let's look at the actual implementation of eBay service. So here is my implementation. Now sometimes you will see that when you use the interface implementation approach, typically the implementation is different for different platforms. You might have an iOS specific implementation or an Android specific implementation. In this case though, this implementation is using pure .NET code. There's nothing platform specific about it. So that allows me to put my implementation in the same PCL as the interface. So here is my implementation. It implements the interface. I've created a few convenient constants with all the URLs that I showed in the slides. And then I've implemented my two methods. So let's look at this simpler one, the find popular items. Here I construct my URL based off of the information I have before, whether I'm calling the find popular items or whether I'm calling get category info. So I construct the appropriate URL to be able to call the find popular items. Then I'm going to construct an HTTP client. So this is built into systems.net.http namespace, where I can make a call to any URL and await it. So I've constructed my HTTP client, and one of the methods on that is getStringAsync. So I give it the URL, and it's going to return to me a string. But because it's asynchronous, I can await it. That will prevent my UI from being blocked. So when this await is done, I'm going to get back the raw JSON. So I mentioned before about JSON as C#, where I can create these C# objects. I want to take this raw JSON and turn it into a list of items. And I can do that using JSON convert. This is part of a JSON.NET or Newtonsoft.json NuGet package that has the ability to serialize and deserialize JSON to and from C# objects. So I'm going to take the raw JSON and I'm going to deserialize that back into the find popular item result. And within that find popular item result is an item array. And inside that item array is finally a list of items. That's really what I'm looking for. So I can do that, and I can just return the item array.item, which is going to be a list of item. So the get categories works pretty much the same way. It's a different URL, but I'm still using the same technique. Create an HTTP client. I'm awaiting the getStringAsync call. I'm using JSON.NET to deserialize that back into C# objects, and then I'm returning the results. So let's get back to our category page and let's try and make a call to this web service. So what I'm going to do is, after I've set up my category page with an empty list right now, I'm going to make a function down below called load data. And this needs to be an asynchronous method because I'm going to need to make await calls inside it. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is get a handle to one of our eBay service implementation. Well, I can do that through Xamarin.Forms built-in dependency service locator. So I can call dependency service.get, and I can say, what am I looking for? I'm looking for something that implements eBay service. And I have to add in the appropriate usings, and I can say, okay, let's just save a local variable that's equal to this eBay service. Now I'm going to be using it through the interface, but the dependency service is going to find an implementation and return that to me. And since the only implementation we have is this one that I just covered, it should return this one to me. So now that I have that, I should be able to make the call called get categories. And in here I want to give it a parent. So I don't yet have a parent. So let's just pass in a null, and this is going to return a list of categories in an asynchronous fashion, so I need to await it. So let's do a list of category, and I need to add in my usings. Okay, so now I've got my list of categories. Now I need to set the item source of my list view to be this list of categories. So I'm going to set item source is equal to categories. Now you can set anything that is an I enumerable to a list view's item source. So a list is definitely I enumerable, so I can just set that. You can set an array of strings, an array of complex objects. Here I'm setting a list of a complex object or a category. So let's run this now and let's see if I get back a list of categories. And you can see I do get back a list of categories, but obviously this is not a good mobile app right now because it's not showing me a category name. So let's fix that. In order to show rather than show the entire category to string method, the built-in string version of a category, I want to show just the name. If I look at a category, I can see that there is a category name in here. So I need to pick just that part and show that in my list. And that's where an item template comes in. So on a list, I can set an item template to be something that I construct. So let's just construct that up here. So I'm going to create a data template. IT is a new data template. And then you want to give it a type of class that you want to use for your cell to display in the list view. So I'm going to use the built-in text cell that comes with Xamarin.Forms, but that's still not good enough. I need to bind to text cell which piece of my complex object to put as the text value of my text cell. So I'm going to bind the text cell's text property. So I want to bind to the text property some property from my category. So if we again look at my category, I know that I've got a category name there. So I'm going to bind to it the category name. And now let's run this and see what we get. And there we have something that looks much better. Here we have a list of category names. So now each category, there's a hierarchy of categories. So if I click on antiques, I should get back another set of categories that are all the children categories of antiques. So let's implement that. So let's reuse this category page, and every time we reuse it, we need to specify what our parent category is going to be. So let's specify a category in the constructor of the page. It's going to represent our parent category. And we're going to say that in a class variable. Parent category, and then we're going to save that in the constructor. Okay, and then we can use this to specify, instead of null, let's specify that parent category to our eBay service so that it will return only the children categories of the parent that we specified. If we try to build this, we can see that our initial application setup is going to fail because we don't have a parent category yet. So let's hard code this one to null because when we first start the app, we don't have a parent category, so we want to show the top level. So now that we have the ability to reuse a category page by specifying a parent, we need to actually do that when we select an item in our list. So I can take the item tapped event and add a handler to it. So let's do this handler format. I'll use the delegate type rather than a lambda expression. You could use a lambda expression if you wanted to. And this will tell me in the item tapped event args what was actually selected in my list. and it will be a category because that is our item source. Our item source is a list of category, so anytime we tap an item, we should get back an actual category object. So I'm going to say, let's have a selected category is equal to whatever my item tapped event arg says it is, which would be item. We're going to do a quick check to make sure that it's not null. So if our selected item is null, then let's not do anything. Let's just return. And we also need to cast this as a category because item is just a plain old object. It doesn't know what it is, so I'm going to tell it what it is. Actually, I'm just going to reuse my category. So I'm going to await the navigation of a push. I have to use async if I'm going to call await. So I'm going to push onto my navigation stack a new page. So I'm going to create a new category page. So I'm going to reuse myself, but now I know what my parent category is going to be. It's the one that I selected in the previous page. So now let's run this. And we should be able to traverse through the hierarchy. So here we have antiques. I click this. We now see ethnographic. I click this. We then see African. So I can continue drilling down the hierarchy. I can go back. Let's pick cell phone and accessories, then display phones, etc. So now I can navigate the category hierarchy. And you might want to make things a little fancy by changing the title. You might want to do something where you use the parent category as part of the title, so something like that. Where if the parent category is null, then we're going to use root categories. If it's not null, it'll be whatever that parent category's name is, categories. Now, let us go into the items part of the eBay service. Eventually, as I navigate through the category hierarchy, then eventually I'm going to reach the bottom of the categories, and then there's no more child categories left. So at that point, I want to show items. So how do I know when I've reached the bottom? So we don't want to keep on showing another category page if we've reached the bottom. Well, luckily, if we look at a category, it has a nice Boolean already in the JSON that's returned to us called leaf category. So this will allow me to check if the selected category is a leaf, then I want to show items instead. So I'm going to make a new page called an item page. And if it's not a leaf category, then go ahead and show the next layer down in the category hierarchy as we showed before. So now my work is to create an item page. So let's go ahead and do that. So under pages, let's create a new file. We'll call it item page. And we need to pass in the constructor, just like we did for the categories page, a parent category. And this parent category will allow us to know what category to read items from. So let's add in the using. We will add in our private class variable for our parent category. And we will save that. Okay, and now this item page, just like before, it's going to be a content page, just like the categories page was. And also, just like the categories page, we want to have a list be our main content. So let us do as we did before and create a class variable for our list view, and we will construct that. So I'm going to just copy some of this code over to item page, and we will always have a parent category because we can't get down to displaying items from a category unless we have a category. So we don't have to check for a parent if it's null or not, but we can just change our title to be items now based on the parent category's name. And we want to, let's not worry about the item template for now. Let's just keep things simple. and add this as our content. And then just like before, we need to load our data. So let's make another function to load our data. So let's copy the one from categories. But this time, instead of calling get categories, we want to call find popular items. So let's add in our usings, and we want find popular items. It still takes a parent category, and find popular items is going to return to us an item. So this should be an item, and let's rename this to be items. And then finally, we're going to assign our item source in our list view to the items that we get back from our eBay service. So now let's run this and see what happens. So we will be able to navigate down through the category hierarchy, and when we reach the bottom, it should show us items instead of category. So if I do antiques, antiquities, Celtic, and here again we have items. So just like before, we have a complex object called item, so we're just seeing the generic toString or the string version of that object for every row. So in order to show something more useful, we need to use our data template again. So what can we use in our data template? Well, we can use, how about title? That sounds good. So let's take our data template, and instead of using category name, it's going to be title. And now if we run that, we should get a nice title for our items when we navigate down to the bottom of the category hierarchy. So let's do the same test again. Antiques, antiquities, Celtic, and then we get the actual title of the items. Okay, so now we're looking better. But I want a better display of item. The title isn't good enough for me. I would like to see an image and a price for this item. So what I want it to look like is something like this, where I want my cell to kind of be like a grid, where I have an image on the left that spans 2 rows, and then I've got on my column on the right, I have a title for the top row and the price for the bottom row. So this is what I want to recreate, and I can do this with Xamarin.Forms grid control. So let's do that. I want to create a custom cell for displaying an item. So I already have a directory called controls in my PCL. Let me add a new file called item cell. And rather than extend content page, this needs to extend a view cell. And view cell is built in the Xamarin.Forms. This is very similar to a content page, except it's a cell where you can put anything you want as the view or the content of that cell. So to do that, I want a label that's going to display my title, so I'm going to call it title label. I want a label that's going to display the price. And then I also want an image, and this image will display the image or the gallery image from eBay as an actual picture, so I can see what it looks like. So we'll call it gallery image is a new image. Now that I've got these 3 things, I need to now put these in a grid in the appropriate places. So let's create our grid. I'll just call it main G. And then I want to be able to, let's put a padding around the entire thing so that it's not touching the edges of our cell. So let's do, how about a padding of 10. Then I need to specify the row and column definitions. So in my example, we can see that I essentially have 2 rows here. The image happens to be spanning 2 of those rows. So I have 2 rows and I have 2 columns. So let's do that. So our first row will have a height equal to a grid length of auto. So this means I want this row to be as tall as it needs to be to display its content. And then I want the same thing for the second row. And then that's all I have for rows. And then for my column definitions, again I have 2 column definitions, so let's create those. And this would be a width. But now in this case, if we look at my example, I don't want the image to take up just the right amount of space, because then some images that may be large may cause a title and price to be shrunk to the right, and for some images that are small, it would cause the title and price to be moved to the left. So I wouldn't have a nice clean boundary for my title and price. So I want to be really specific what the size of my image is going to be. But I don't want to be specific in terms of raw pixels. You should never hard code raw pixels except for padding, for example. So I'm going to use percentages, and the grid control allows us to use percentages. So I'm going to use 20% of the width of my cell to be the image, and the remaining 80% to be the title and the price column. So in order to do that, I can use the constructor of grid length, and I can say I want to use 1 star value for the width of the first column, which is going to be my image, and then I want to use 4 star values for the width of my second column. Now what does that do? Well, if you take all the stars, if you add them up together, you're going to get a 5. So 1/5 will be the first column, and 4/5 will be the width of the second column. So that gives me 20% and 80%. So now I have my main grid created with the appropriate row and columns. Now I need to add my title, price, and gallery to my grid. So we will say main-g children add. Let's add my gallery image to the first column and first row. We're numbering from 0, so that's the first column, first row. But I want to make sure that my gallery spans 2 rows. So we will do a set row span on my gallery for 2. Okay, now let's add in the other 2 children. I'm going to add in the title, and this time we want it to be the second column, which counting from 0 would be a 1, but we do want it to be the very first row, so that's going to be 0 for the row. And then finally for the price, I want to use also the second column, which would be a 1, but I want the second row for that. Now that I have my grid, I can set the view for my view cell to be the entire grid. Now before I do that, I want to do a few things to pretty this up a bit. So for my price, let's make this a little bit better. I want my price right justified. So I'm going to add some properties to my price label so that the horizontal text alignment will be the N, so that it's right justified. I also want to bold it. So let's do font attributes and make it font attributes bold. And I want it to be a smaller font than the title. So let's just pick something, how about 12 for that. Okay. Now let's try to use this custom cell in our items page. So to do that, we already have this data template set up, and it's set to use a text cell. Well, let's actually use our custom cell instead. Now when we do that, we don't have a text property anymore. So instead of doing the binding here in the page, instead we're going to do the binding inside our cell itself. And we can do that because we designed this cell to be specific to an item in eBay. So we know that this will be bound to an item C# object. So I can go ahead and do my bindings here. So let's bind our gallery image, set binding. Set binding in this case has a nice type safe method where I can specify the type of object that's going to be bound to this cell or this image, as long as I add in the using. So let's do that. And what that allows me to do is I don't have to use a string when I specify what to bind to. I can use a type safe lambda expression instead. So this is an image. So an image has a source property, which I can bind a URL to this. So this is where I can do my lambda expressions. I can say, given an image, then I want to use the image.gallery URL. And this lambda expression, you can see if the gallery URL ever changes its name through refactoring, for example, this will also be changed. This is different than our category page binding right here, which uses the string version. So if the category name property of a category ever changes, the refactoring won't know to change this too. So I prefer to use the lambda expressions when all possible for my bindings so that everything is changed during a refactoring. So I'm going to set my image source to the gallery URL, and let's bind the other two things. So we have our title and we have our price, and these are labels. So we need to use the label.text property because there is no source property for labels. And then what do we want to use out of our image for the title? Well, we know that we have a title property. And then for the price, what do we have for price? Well, we have something called converted current price. And inside there, we have something called value. And this value is a double. So there is our binding. So now let's try this out and see what we get. We should now see this nice grid that I showed in my slides when we get down to our items after navigating through some categories. Let's go to antiques, antiquities, Celtic, and now you can see it's starting to look right. We do have our nice images. You can see that everything is aligned because even though this image was smaller, it's still taking up 20% of the width, so everything gets lined. But you can see our biggest problem is our height of our rows. It's just not right. It looks like we have a constant row height. Well, the way to handle that in Forms is on your list view in the item page, you can specify that all of our rows may be uneven in terms of their size. That will cause the auto sizing feature to kick in. So now let's run that, and we should get an appropriate height for every row based on the content of that row. So now let's navigate down through the same category hierarchy, so antiques, antiquities, and Celtic. And now you can see we have something that looks a lot better. One final thing that I would like to do is I want to put a dollar sign in front of this price. In a real eBay application, obviously you would want to use the appropriate money symbol for the region that this app is running in, but for simplicity, for this demo, we're just going to hard code it to a dollar sign. So how do we do that? Well, the actual binding that we're using for our price is bound to a double. And there's nothing in the item that already has a dollar sign with the value after it. So what we can do is we can use a value converter. A value converter is something that'll take the value that we're trying to bind to our UI, run it through a converter before it gets bound to our UI. So if I hit a comma and I can do a converter and I can specify some converter. So let's make one called a price value converter, and this will take a price value and convert it into a string that will have that dollar sign. So how do we do a converter? Well, here I already have a directory for all of the converters that I might need, so I'm going to add in a new file. It's just a generic class. We'll call it price value converter. And all value converters need to implement the same interface, which is iValueConverter. So let's use our using for that. And we need to actually implement that interface. So we can do that through the refactoring that Xamarin Studio provides. You can see we have a convert and a convert back. The reason you have two is you may need to convert to the thing that needs to be bound to the UI, as well as you may need to convert from the value in the UI back to a value for your model. In our case, we're not using two-way binding. We're just going from our model to our UI. So we only have to implement the convert. And all I need to do there is I'm just going to return a string. So this value should be the double. I'm just going to hard code returning the string of what the dollar sign symbol with the double value. And now let's run this, and we should see the price value with the dollar sign in front. So again, we will do the same test with antiques, antiquities, and Celtic, and you can now see we have a $sign in front of all of our prices. So one final thing that I wanted to do for the iOS version is if you're an iOS user, you probably are used to seeing a little greater than symbol on the right of all of our rows, especially if it's something like this where when I click this, it's going to take me to another page. That's what that greater than symbol is for, is to let me know that when I click this, something's going to happen and most likely I'm going to see another page. So I want my category page to have these greater than symbols. Well, these greater than symbols or disclosure indicators is an iOS only feature. So you cannot do that in Forms code because Forms tries to do tries to cover the common features of all the platforms. But one thing you can do in Forms is you can customize it. So I'm going to do a custom renderer for iOS only to add that disclosure indicator. So the way I'm going to do that is I need a way to customize only the category cells. So to do that, I'm going to just create a dummy category cell, and I'm going to use that in my categories page. So currently my category page is using the built-in text cell. So I'm going to use a category cell instead. So I want my category cell to just extend text cell because text cell has everything in it that I need. I don't need to do anything special with it on the form side. All this special class is doing is giving me a a different named class that I can add a renderer to. Because if I add a renderer to the text cell, it's going to affect all text cells in my application. I want to only affect the category cell or the cells that are used on my categories page. So I create just a dummy class with a different name that extends the functionality that I really want, but now I've got this name. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that my category page actually uses this cell. So now it's going to use a category cell. Now I can add my custom render. And again, this is for iOS only. So I have in my iOS project a directory for renderers. So let's create a new renderer. We'll call it category cell renderer. And this is going to extend what my normal render would have been. So this is normally a text cell. So I'm just going to extend the normal text cell renderer. So let's add in my usings. Okay, I have my usings, and now I need to override the appropriate method to change the way this text cell is rendered. So if I do override, I can see I've got a method called getCell that I can override. So if you are familiar with the iOS dev kit, you will now start to see some iOS specific classes like UIKit and UI table view cell. So if anything that you can do to a UI table view cell, you can do here in this custom renderer. So I'm going to take the normal return value from the base class text cell render. I'm going to return that, but before I return it, this is when I can attach onto it my custom behavior. So I'm going to set the accessory to this to be my disclosure indicator. Now, one final piece to make this work is Xamarin.Forms needs to know how to find this renderer for use whenever it's displaying a category cell. So the way you do that is you add in an annotation, and it looks something like this, where I'm going to export this renderer to handle cells of type category cell, and this is why we needed that special name, because I didn't want to change just all text cells. I just wanted to change the ones used for category page, and I want to use the category cell renderer to render that so that you can see use this renderer for this cell. And now when I run this code for iOS only, this renderer should kick in and I should get the disclosure indicator for my category page. And there you go. There is the disclosure indicator. So as we drill down through the categories, you will see the disclosure indicator. And then eventually we're going to get to the bottom, and then we'll start showing the items like we saw before. So that completes the iOS version. Now, here's the beauty of Xamarin.Forms. I did not once test Android during this entire demo, but I wrote all of the code in my PCL project, which is shared. So let's see if I were to run the Android version of this, let's see where we are. So I have my Nexus 4 Lollipop simulator running. So I'm going to run this and it will eventually launch. And here we go, it's launching the app, and we can see our root categories, and now we can see we have the same exact application running on Android. Now remember, our disclosure indicator that we just added, that was for iOS only. We only created an iOS custom renderer for that. By not creating a custom render on the Android side, it's just using the stock text cell render, which doesn't have anything on the right. But all the functionality which is created in the PCL, which is shared code, I know it's all going to work because I already tested on iOS. So I can just start drilling down and everything works. I still have my custom cell because I did my custom cell in Xamarin.Forms, so all that code is reusable. I got right justification, I have my value converter with the dollar sign, and I have my images. So that concludes the introduction to Xamarin Forms and my eBay browser sample application. Thank you.